An arrogant CEO fired a struggling single father just to look powerful, but he built a massive empire to destroy her.
Okay.
I remember him standing there, a mountain of sorrow, the formidable rival I had crossed paths with.
This arrogant young CEO thought she destroyed a poor warehouse manager, but his brutal revenge cost her millions.
The 18th floor conference room of Caldwell Atelier was an architectural expression of a zero-sum game. Situated above the sprawling gray of Cleveland, its glass walls and polished glass table mirrored the desolate winter outside. The air inside didn't just feel cold, it felt sharpened, engineered to cut before a single word was spoken. Through the floor-to-ceiling panes, snow drifted past like ash. Around the long table sat investors in obsidian suits, their expressions as tight as their neckties. Across from them, senior managers held their hands folded in sepulchral silence, the posture of people waiting to see who among them would be the morning's sacrifice. At the head stood Serafina Caldwell. At 28, she was the newly minted chief executive of her family's legacy, beautiful, brilliant, and visibly furious. Her rich brown hair fell loose around the shoulders of a cream-colored V-neck dress, a styling that had landed her on 2 major magazine covers that year. She looked impeccable, sharp, and entirely out of place amidst the manufacturing metrics. A slender folder of returned product complaints sat before her, as if presentation could mitigate disaster. At the far end of the room stood Elias Whitaker, 29. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short, dark brown hair and a face that had stopped trying to masquerade as anything other than exhausted. His white shirt was clean, but worn thin at the collar. He held his own folder, a thick, bruised thing stuffed with photographs of cracked veneer, comparison charts of oak shipments, and a quiet proposal he had stayed up 3 nights to finalize. Serafina did not offer him a chair. She offered only a cold mandate to explain. Elias began with the unvarnished truth. The North Star prototype shipment had failed inspection because the new, low-cost timber was warping in cold transit. He detailed how the new packaging contractor was slicing protective foam in half to save minutes, and how the revised freight road ran through 2 extra transfer points in sub-zero zones. He had documentation for it all. Then, gently, he offered his list of engineered solutions. Fixes that would cost less than the company was already losing in chargebacks. Serafina severed his explanation before the 3rd sentence. She did not need solutions, she said, her voice dropping an octave. She needed accountability. Investors did not bankroll excuses. She held up the slender folder of customer complaints, turning her gaze on the room. She asked how a warehouse manager who clocking out at 5 p.m. to pick up his daughter could possibly expect to keep pace with the national rollout. None of the other managers spoke. Carter Blake, the senior director who had sponsored the cheap supplier deal to secure his bonus, stared intently at his notepad. A small sound at the doorway turned every head. Louisa Whitaker stood in the gap, 6 years old, possessing her father's solemn brown eyes and hugging a worn, one-eared plush rabbit tight against her chest. School had let out early due to the weather. The receptionist, panicked and out of options, had brought her up. The little girl stood very still, witnessing her father standing alone at the far end of the long glass table. Serafina saw the child, and instead of softening, her resolve forged into something viciously sharp. "There it is," she said, her voice low theater for the investors. Some men, she remarked, were always being pulled out of meetings by their personal lives. Some men could never carry a real load. Then she turned her gaze back on Elias. "You're finished, Elias." The room held its breath, waiting for a plea, an outburst, a defense. It never came. Elias didn't even look at Serafina again. He looked at his daughter, noticing the rabbit slipping from her tired arms. He walked the length of the silent conference table without hurry, his heavy boots sounding a counterpoint to the polite silence. He knelt down, picked up the rabbit, brushed a stray piece of lint off its gray fur, and placed it carefully back into Louisa's hands. Then he took her hand, and they walked out. Serafina thought she had ended a man. She had only freed him 3 years prior. Elias had buried his wife, Hannah. Her heart had quietly surrendered after a long, expensive illness that doctors named and renamed without ever stopping. When she died, Louisa was 3. The world had narrowed to a single shape for Elias after that. Mornings began before sunrise. Evenings ended only when the dishes were bleached, and Louisa had stopped asking when her mother was coming back. He never spoke of his grief at work. Caldwell Atelier paid him to manage the East warehouse, not to mourn, so he became a man of sterile routine. He learned to braid Louisa's hair himself, badly at first, then with precise competence. His title was warehouse manager, but his real work was something the executives on the 18th floor never had the time to see. Elias possessed an old-fashioned kind of competence. He understood that products do not lie, that a brittle hinge will remain a brittle hinge no matter how beautifully the brochure is photographed. He knew which oak handled the humid transit through Pittsburgh and which cracked crossing Lake Erie in February. He paid for extra inspection labor out of his own pocket to shield the company from quality failures, filing proposals that were never answered. His patience was not weakness. It was the discipline of a father who could not afford the luxury of walking out. Serafina Caldwell was on paper the smartest CEO the company had ever had. She held a graduate degree in industrial design and a gift for staging. She had inherited the chair 2 years prior after her father, the founder, was diagnosed with a heart condition that barred him from the sawdust and sweat of the workshop floor. Her father had built the Caldwell name on boring virtues: reliable joinery, honest grain, lifetime hinges. He knew every craftsman by name. He had once told a young Serafina that the worst thing a furniture company could do was outgrow its own carpenters. She remembered the sentence, but she had not understood it. When she took over, she saw a company that was good at the wrong things. The catalog featured beige textures. Serafina wanted Caldwell Atelier quoted alongside boutique design houses in New York and Milan. She wanted profit margins that matched a luxury image. From the conference room, her decisions looked correct. She rebranded, hired a creative director from a fashion house, and moved presentations to a gallery downtown. What she could not see was that her progress depended on cutting the parts of the business that did not photograph well. The bid that changed everything arrived in early autumn. North Star Hospitality was renovating 40 properties. It was the largest order in Caldwell's history. Serafina promised the board a rollout that would set the industry standard. To deliver the necessary margins, she slashed costs. She replaced the longtime hardwood supplier with a discount mill in the Carolinas, thinned the quality inspection team by 2/3, outsourced packing, and put the East Warehouse, the old, reliable workhorse facility, on the market. Slide deck by slide deck, the numbers obeyed her. Down in the workshop, Elias saw the reality. The new oak warped after 2 days. The new lacquers scratched at the lightest contact. The outsourced packing team was an active threat to the product. He wrote his detailed, carefully measured proposal, laying out a plan to use the East Warehouse as a final quality check facility. The proposal landed in Carter Blake's inbox. Carter read enough to feel threatened, then wrote a summary memo to Serafina with a single, damning opening sentence. Warehouse management is resisting the new strategy and recommending a return to legacy practices. Serafina trusted the man in the tailored shirt over the man standing next to a pallet of returned hinges. Then came the disastrous North Star prototype failures, leading to the meeting where Serafina chose to make an example of Elias. The drive home after the firing was quiet. Cleveland's late autumn streets were the color of wet iron. Louisa hugged the rabbit and watched the buildings slide past. In their small, warm apartment, Elias set 2 plates of pasta on the table. Louisa ate 3 bites and set her fork down. "Dad," she said, her voice small. He looked up. "Are you really finished?" Years later, Elias would say that no quarterly report, no public humiliation had ever cut him as cleanly as that question. He swallowed twice before answering. He came around the table and knelt next to her chair. He didn't speak ill of Serafina or Caldwell Atelier. "No, sweetheart, I'm not finished," he said gently. "I just got pushed out of a place that stopped seeing what I was worth. Mom used to tell me I had a habit of seeing things that still worked in the stuff other people threw away. I'm going to start with that." That night, after Louisa fell asleep, Elias sat at the kitchen table with the folder Serafina had refused to read. He turned to the section about the East Side warehouse. He knew its bones. The north wall was settling, and the roof leaked, but the foundations were solid, and the truck bays connected to the interstate in 10 minutes. The surrounding blocks were full of laid-off craftsmen who had once worked for Caldwell. He took out a blank sheet of paper and wrote 2 words in block letters at the top. Whitaker Built. The next morning, before sunrise, Elias met Oliver Grant, a tired real estate broker. At the warehouse's chain-link gate, Oliver didn't bother pretending the place had charm, detailing the mold, the ancient wiring, and the cosmetic failures. Elias walked the perimeter. He pressed his palm against the concrete floor. It wasn't lifting. He gauged the turning radius of the lot. "What are you thinking of doing with it?" Oliver asked. Elias looked at the angled Caldwell Atelier sign over the loading dock. What the people who left it didn't know how to do anymore. Elias sold his pickup truck. He drained his savings and Hannah's life insurance. Then, he swallowed his pride and drove to the home of Henry Bell, a retired master carpenter who had worked under Serafina's father. Henry listened to the plan. Without a speech, he opened a desk drawer, took out a folder holding his personal savings, and slid it across the table. "You make the kind of furniture I would put my grandkids on." Henry said that was the contract. The collateral was Elias's name. Henry also gave him 2 phone numbers: Archie Nolan, a frame specialist Serafina had laid off, and Bernie Wallace, a packing veteran. Within a week, Elias closed on the property. He brought Louisa to see it on a Saturday. "Is this your new company, Dad?" she asked. Elias looked at the cracked wall and the steel beams. "Not yet, honey, but it will be." The first months of Whitaker Built looked less like a company and more like 4 men with old tools, salvaged lumber, and a lot of paint. Elias stayed up nights, drawing modular furniture diagrams. His business strategy was deliberate. Whitaker Built would chase everything Caldwell Atelier had dismissed. Family-run motels, mid-priced chains, small offices, apartments for working renters, places that needed furniture that could survive thousands of guests. 3 things defined every piece. The frames were modular, fixable in minutes. The packaging was over-engineered, and the warranty line was answered by a person who actually knew how to build the product. For 6 weeks, they barely made ends meet. But the warehouse was filling with sawdust and rhythm. The 4 men inside began to feel something they hadn't in years: the pride of building, not just shipping. Their first customer was Vanessa Reed, owner of an 18-room motel. Caldwell Atelier had politely informed her that her order size was not aligned with their brand positioning. She came to Whitaker Built expecting a smooth pitch. Instead, she got a tired father in a clean flannel shirt who showed her 3 sample pieces, named a fair price, and promised a delivery date. She liked the directness and placed the order. The furniture arrived on time, unscarred, each piece carrying a small brass tag inside the drawer. Whitaker Built, Cleveland, Ohio. Word of mouth began to spread. First to a friend in Lakewood, then to a small chain in Pennsylvania. Whitaker Built didn't grow by advertising. It grew by reputation among people advertising never reached. Inside Caldwell Atelier, Bernice Howard, the chief accountant, noticed the receivables thinning out. Sales told Serafina that long-time mid-market clients were switching to a new vendor on the east side. When Serafina realized who it was, and that he was operating out of the building she had ordered sold, she felt a cold movement of doubt cross her chest. The North Star Hospitality final meeting was held in Chicago in mid-March. Serafina arrived in a dark red wool dress, convinced the meeting was about design language. She was wrong. The committee chair, David Reston, who had run hotels for 40 years, asked about maintenance costs, repair times, and long-haul defect rates. Serafina answered in the language of heritage, and experienced Carter Blake produced rounded, generic numbers. Then Whitaker Built was called in. Elias, Archie, Bernie, and a young logistics manager, Hillary Stone, walked in. They brought no slide deck. They brought 1 bedside table, 1 wall-mounted desk, and a small steel toolbox. Elias asked the committee to imagine a guest gouging a nightstand face. He asked what their current vendor required for repair. Then he opened the toolbox, removed 2 screws, slid the damaged face panel out, and slid a fresh one in. 2 minutes, the committee leaned forward. He didn't mention Caldwell Atelier once. Why should we trust a small company with a national rollout? David Reston asked. Elias answered without raising his voice. Because we were built out of the mistakes that big companies are no longer willing to look at. We aren't promising you faster delivery in a slogan. We are promising you a system designed to deliver. Whitaker Built won the first wave of the contract. Caldwell Atelier was dismissed outside the boardroom, in a corridor that smelled of cleaning fluid and fresh flowers. Serafina caught up with Elias. Did you do all of this to prove me wrong? She asked, her voice lower than usual. Elias took a breath. No, he said. I did it so my daughter would know that one cruel sentence doesn't get to decide who her father is. He spoke once more, gently. He told her she had weakened her company not through lack of intelligence, but because she had forgotten that the brand was the foundation, not the photograph. She listened in silence. She didn't argue. She watched him walk away with his folder and his toolbox. In the months that followed, Whitaker Built flourished. Caldwell Atelier rehired its senior inspectors and began the slow process of remembering itself. On a late autumn evening, Elias brought Louisa to the warehouse. Archie and Bernie were finishing a custom order. Louisa held the rabbit in her father's hand, looking up at the new blue sign glowing over the bay. Dad, she said, are you still sad that she said you were finished? Elias looked at the lot, at his crew, and thought about the single sheet of paper from years ago. No, sweetheart, he said. Sometimes people only call you finished because they aren't standing close enough to see you starting over. Inside, the engines of a truck started up. Bernie Wallace laughed. The blue letters of the sign caught the last of the streetlights. Serafina had not known that some people only truly begin when the rest of the world believes they have nothing left to lose.